The first thing I felt when I woke up was blood running into my mouth. The second thing I felt was the weight of the earth pressing against my chest. I tried to scream, but the sound died inside the wooden coffin surrounding me. I remembered the blade. I remembered the villagers standing in a circle. I remembered the man I trusted most lowering his eyes as they drove the knife into my heart. I remembered dying. My name is Caleb Mercer, and I had spent more than 200 years hiding the fact that I could not grow old. But the people of Blackthorn Village had finally discovered what I was. They didn't kill me because I was immortal. They killed me because, 3 nights earlier, I had walked beneath their church and seen something that no living man was supposed to see. Something they had been feeding for generations. Something that knew my name long before I was born. And now, trapped inside my own grave, I heard 3 slow knocks beneath me. Knock, knock, knock. Then a voice whispered through the earth. You were killed because you remembered what happened before you were born. I stopped struggling. I stopped breathing. Because I knew that voice. I had heard it in my dreams for 200 years. 7 days earlier, Blackthorn Village looked like the safest place in the world. It sat between 2 enormous mountain ranges, surrounded by pine forests and a river so clear that the villagers drank directly from it. Smoke rose from chimneys every morning. Children ran through narrow streets. Farmers carried baskets toward the market. Church bells rang at sunrise and sunset. Travelers passing through would have seen nothing unusual. But Caleb Mercer had learned long ago that appearances meant very little. He had lived in Blackthorn for 43 years under the same face, the same height, the same dark hair, the same scar beneath his left eye. The villagers believed he was the son of the Caleb who had lived there before him. Then, when that explanation became impossible, they decided he was a grandson. Caleb never corrected them. He had learned that immortality was easier to survive when nobody knew about it. But Blackthorn was different. The village had always known more about him than he knew about himself. Caleb had watched people age while he remained unchanged. He had watched boys become fathers, fathers become grandfathers, and grandfathers disappear beneath the ground. He had stood at hundreds of funerals while wearing the same face. He had learned how to grieve quietly. He had learned when to leave a town before people began asking questions. He had changed names, occupations, clothing, and entire identities, but somehow he always returned to Blackthorn. Every time he tried to travel beyond the eastern mountain road, he became sick. Every time he attempted to cross the northern forest, he found himself walking back toward the village without remembering turning around. It was as if something had tied an invisible rope around his soul. He had spent decades believing it was a curse. Then, on a cold morning in October, a young woman named Clara Whitmore disappeared. Nobody searched for her. That was what frightened Caleb most. Clara was 22 years old. She worked at the bakery with her mother and was known throughout the village because she never went anywhere without a silver necklace her father had given her before he died. On Tuesday morning, she simply failed to arrive at work. Her mother waited. Her friends waited. By noon, everyone knew she was missing. Yet by sunset, the village had returned to normal. There were no search parties. No horses were sent into the forest. Nobody questioned the people who had last seen her. When Caleb asked Clara's mother whether she wanted help, the woman stared at him with a strange blank expression. "Who is Clara?" she asked. Caleb thought she was joking. She wasn't. The woman had forgotten her own daughter. Caleb walked away from the house with his stomach turning. That night, he searched the village records and discovered something impossible. Clara's name had disappeared from every document in Blackthorn. It was as if she had never existed. Caleb had seen death many times, but this wasn't death. Death left evidence. A grave. A memory. A photograph. A grieving family. Clara had left none of those things behind. Her room was still filled with clothing. Her shoes were beneath the bed. Her favorite book remained open on the table. But everyone who had loved her had forgotten that she had ever lived. Caleb spent the entire night searching through old records. At sunrise, he found 6 more names. All of them had vanished in exactly the same way. Each person had disappeared once every 12 years. Each disappearance had happened after that person visited the old church at the center of Blackthorn. Caleb stared at the dates until his hands began shaking. The next disappearance was supposed to happen in 6 days. He knew the name because he had seen it in the village registry. Daniel Reeves, a 17-year-old boy who delivered bread from one end of Blackthorn to the other. Caleb had known Daniel since childhood. And Caleb had a terrible feeling that Daniel was about to become the next name erased from history. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, Caleb had no intention of waiting 6 days. That same night, he followed Daniel. The boy left the bakery shortly after midnight, carrying an empty basket. He walked toward the old church, but he didn't enter through the front door. Instead, he stopped beside the stone wall and looked around. Caleb watched from the shadows. Daniel pressed his palm against one of the stones. A faint red symbol appeared beneath his hand. The wall opened. Daniel disappeared inside. Caleb waited several seconds before following him. What he found beyond the wall would change everything he believed about Blackthorn. Beneath the church was a staircase carved directly into the mountain. There were no torches, yet the walls seemed to glow with a faint blue light. Caleb descended slowly. He heard Daniel's footsteps somewhere below. Then he heard another sound. Whispering. Hundreds of voices speaking at once. Caleb stopped. One voice separated itself from the others. It whispered his name. Caleb. He turned around. Nobody was there. He continued downward. The staircase seemed to have no end. 10 steps became 50. 50 became 100. The air grew colder. Then the stone walls changed. Ancient carvings appeared beneath the blue light. Caleb ran his fingers across them and suddenly felt dizzy. The carvings showed people kneeling before a gigantic creature with no face. They were carrying bowls filled with what looked like blood. Behind them stood 3 figures wearing crowns. Gods, Caleb thought, or something pretending to be gods. But the strangest figure in every carving was a young man standing apart from everyone else. Caleb stared at him. The man's face was identical to his own. Not similar. Not close. Identical. Same dark hair. Same scar beneath the left eye. Same expression. Caleb pulled his hand away from the wall. He had spent 2 centuries trying to understand where his immortality came from. Now he was staring at a drawing of himself that looked hundreds, perhaps thousands, of years old. At the bottom of the staircase, Caleb found Daniel standing before a massive stone door. The boy was crying. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel whispered. Caleb stepped closer. "Neither should you." Daniel turned around. His face was pale. "They told me I had to come." "Who?" Daniel pointed at the door. "The people underneath." Caleb looked at the stone. "There's nobody underneath." Daniel shook his head. "That's what they want you to believe." Then the door opened by itself. A cold wind rushed past them. Caleb entered first. The chamber beyond was enormous. Hundreds of stone coffins lined the walls. Some were broken. Others were sealed. Every coffin carried a name. Caleb moved closer to the nearest one. He recognized the name. Nathaniel Mercer. He opened another. Jonathan Mercer. Another. Caleb Mercer. His hands became numb. He walked farther into the chamber and discovered dozens more. Caleb Mercer. Caleb Mercer. Caleb Mercer. The same name repeated across centuries. Daniel whispered, "Why are there so many graves with your name?" Caleb had no answer. Then one of the coffins moved. A deep scraping sound echoed through the chamber. Caleb stepped backward. The stone lid slid open by itself. Inside was a skeleton wearing an old black coat. Around its neck hung a silver necklace. Caleb recognized it immediately. It belonged to Clara Whitmore. Daniel covered his mouth. "That's Clara's necklace." Caleb stared at the skeleton. She was here. The realization hit him with terrible force. Clara hadn't disappeared. She had been taken. The village hadn't forgotten her by accident. Someone had deliberately erased her from the memories of everyone who loved her. Caleb reached into the coffin and touched the necklace. The moment his fingers closed around it, a vision exploded inside his mind. He saw Clara standing in the same chamber. He saw villagers surrounding her. He saw the elder, Samuel Crow, standing at the front. And behind Samuel stood a gigantic black shape with hundreds of eyes. Clara was crying. Samuel told her that her sacrifice would protect Blackthorn. Then the creature opened its mouth. Caleb heard Clara scream. He dropped the necklace. Daniel stared at him. "What did you see?" Caleb didn't answer immediately, because he had seen something else. At the end of the vision, Clara had looked directly at him. Not at the person Caleb had been. At the person Caleb was now. And she had whispered 4 words. "You're next, Caleb Mercer." The chamber went silent. Then the church bells above them began ringing. 1, 2, 3. Daniel looked toward the staircase. "Someone knows we're here." Caleb grabbed his arm. "Run." They raced toward the stairs. But before they reached the first step, the enormous stone door slammed shut behind them. The blue light disappeared. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Daniel began pounding on the door. Caleb tried to move it, but the stone didn't respond. Then footsteps echoed from the opposite side of the chamber. Slow footsteps. Deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking toward them. Caleb turned. A figure emerged from the darkness carrying a lantern. It was Samuel Crow, the oldest man in Blackthorn. Caleb had known him for decades. He had always considered Samuel wise, gentle, and trustworthy. But now Samuel's face looked completely different. There was no warmth in his eyes. "You should have left this alone," Samuel said. Caleb stepped in front of Daniel. "Where is Clara?" Samuel smiled. "Clara has already fulfilled her purpose." "What purpose?" "The same purpose you will fulfill." Caleb's blood ran cold. Samuel raised the lantern. Behind him, hundreds of faces appeared in the darkness. Villagers. Men, women, children, elderly people. All standing silently. Daniel whispered, "They followed us." Samuel looked at Caleb. "No." He pointed toward the walls. "They have been waiting for him." Caleb turned. The stone carvings were glowing. Every carving showing the mysterious young man was changing. The figure's eyes were opening. Then the chamber shook. Something beneath the floor moved. The villagers immediately fell to their knees. Samuel lowered his head. Caleb heard a sound beneath the stone. A heartbeat. One enormous heartbeat. Boom. Then another. Boom. The entire chamber trembled. Samuel whispered, "Our guardian is hungry." Caleb looked at him. "Guardian?" Samuel's eyes lifted. "The thing you saw wasn't a monster." Caleb stared at the floor. Samuel continued, "It is the reason this village still exists." The heartbeat grew louder. Boom. 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 "The mountains protect us. The river protects us. The church protects us. But none of those things are what keeps Blackthorn alive." Samuel stepped closer. "Every 12 years, the village gives it a life." Daniel began crying. Caleb looked at Samuel. "And Clara?" "One life." "And Daniel?" "Another." Caleb's voice became colder. "And me?" Samuel smiled. "You are different." The chamber fell silent. Samuel looked directly into Caleb's eyes. "You are not a sacrifice." Caleb frowned. "Then what am I?" Samuel's smile disappeared. "You are the reason it wakes." The floor cracked. A black hand pushed through the stone. Daniel screamed. Caleb grabbed him and ran toward the sealed door. Samuel did not follow. He simply stood there and watched. Caleb slammed his shoulder against the stone. Nothing. He struck it again. Nothing. Then he heard Samuel speaking behind him. "Do you know why you never age?" Caleb stopped. "Do you know why every road out of Blackthorn brings you back?" Caleb slowly turned. "Do you know why you have dreams about a place you've never visited?" Samuel raised the lantern. "Because this isn't the first time you've lived here." Caleb stared at him. Samuel's final words came quietly. "And it isn't the first time you've died here." A flash of white light filled the chamber. Caleb saw himself standing in the village hundreds of years earlier. He saw himself holding a sword. He saw the villagers kneeling before him. He saw 3 enormous beings descending from the sky. And he heard his own voice say something that terrified him more than anything Samuel could have said. "I created this." The vision vanished. Caleb fell to his knees. Daniel grabbed his shoulder. "Caleb, what happened?" Caleb looked at his hands. He could barely breathe. "I remember." Daniel shook his head. "Remember what?" Caleb looked toward Samuel. The old man was smiling. "I remember the first village." Samuel's expression changed. For the first time, he looked afraid. Caleb stood. "I remember the temple." The black hand beneath the floor stopped moving. "I remember the 3 gods." The villagers began whispering. "And I remember the thing beneath us." Samuel stepped backward. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. "But there's one thing I still don't remember." Samuel asked quietly, "What?" Caleb looked directly at him. "Why did I kill all of you the first time?" The lantern went out. The chamber became completely black. Then a voice came from beneath the earth. Not Samuel's. Not Daniel's. Not Caleb's. Something older. Something enormous. Something that had been waiting for Caleb to remember. It whispered his name. Caleb Mercer. Then the stone beneath his feet split open. And Caleb saw the truth waiting below. It wasn't a creature trapped beneath Blackthorn. It was a grave larger than the village itself. And carved across the stone were 3 words that made Caleb's blood run cold. "Here lies God." Caleb stared at the words. Daniel whispered, "What does that mean?" Caleb didn't answer. Because the moment he read those words, another memory returned. He remembered standing over that grave. He remembered holding the same black sword. And he remembered 3 gods kneeling before him. But the worst part wasn't what he remembered. It was what came next. He remembered killing them. All 3. Then he remembered turning toward the village and saying, "One day, I will come back." Caleb's eyes widened. The chamber shook violently. The villagers began screaming. Samuel dropped to his knees. And somewhere beneath the grave, something began laughing. Caleb looked at Daniel. "Get out." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not leaving you. You have to." "Why?" Caleb looked toward the darkness. "Because I finally understand why they are afraid of me." He reached for the black sword hidden beneath the stone. The moment his fingers touched it, the entire chamber exploded with light. Every coffin opened. Every erased name returned. Every forgotten voice screamed at once. And Caleb remembered his first life. Not as a victim, not as a prisoner, not as an immortal boy, but as something far more dangerous. Something the village had spent centuries trying to bury. Something the dark gods had once feared. Something Caleb himself had forgotten. He had not been born immortal. He had been made immortal. And the people who made him were the same people who had just tried to kill him. But Caleb didn't yet know the worst part. The people of Blackthorn had not created him to protect the village. They had created him to protect the world from himself. And 7 days from now, they would kill him again. Only this time, Caleb would remember everything. Caleb Mercer remembered everything. The memory did not return gently. It struck him with the force of a collapsing world, tearing through every lie he had believed about himself. He remembered the first time he had opened his eyes beneath the mountains. He remembered a world before Blackthorn existed, when the valley was nothing but stone, forests, and a river cutting through the earth. He remembered being young, but not human in the way he had always imagined. He had been created by 3 beings who called themselves gods. They had given him a body that would never age, a mind capable of remembering centuries, and one purpose: to guard a place they feared to approach themselves. That place was beneath the mountain. The villagers had not built Blackthorn to worship the thing below. They had built the village to imprison it. But the prison required a guardian, and Caleb had been that guardian. The terrible part was that he had eventually discovered the gods had lied to him. Caleb remembered the first betrayal. The 3 gods had told him that the creature beneath the mountain was evil and that it had once tried to destroy the world. They told him that every generation of villagers was descended from the people who had survived its attack. They told him that Caleb's immortality existed so he could protect humanity forever. For centuries, Caleb believed them. He fought creatures in the forest. He protected the village from storms and famine. He guarded the underground temple. Whenever the earth trembled, he descended beneath the church and reinforced the ancient seal. But then Caleb began noticing something strange. The creature never attacked anyone. It never tried to escape. Whenever the seal weakened, it called Caleb's name. It begged him to listen. It showed him memories that the gods had forbidden him to see. Eventually, Caleb realized the creature was not trying to escape the prison. It was trying to warn him about the people who had built it. The first memory showed Caleb standing before the 3 gods. Their names had been forgotten by the villagers, but Caleb remembered them now. There was Malachur, the god of judgment, whose voice could command the dead. There was Vera, the goddess of memory, who could erase entire lifetimes from the minds of men. And there was Orden, the god of creation, who had shaped Caleb's immortal body. Together, they had ruled the valley for thousands of years. But they feared one thing above everything else. They feared that humans would eventually learn that the gods were not eternal. They could die. They could be forgotten. Their power depended on the memories and fear of those who worshipped them. So they created Blackthorn as a place where generations of people would be taught to fear the creature beneath the mountain. Every 12 years, a person would be sacrificed. Their death would strengthen the prison, but it would also strengthen the gods. The villagers believed they were protecting themselves. In reality, they were feeding the very powers controlling them. Caleb remembered the night he discovered the truth. He had descended beneath the temple after hearing the creature calling his name. Instead of attacking him, it showed him the history of Blackthorn. He saw villagers kneeling before the gods. He saw children being taught that the creature was a demon. He saw families surrendering loved ones every 12 years. He saw memories being erased so nobody would question the ritual. Then he saw something that broke his heart. Caleb had been the first sacrifice, not the first person to die, but the first person whose memories were deliberately erased. Every time he discovered the truth, the gods killed him and reset his life. They could not destroy his immortal body, so they destroyed his memories. They had been doing it for centuries. Every Caleb Mercer who had ever lived was the same Caleb. Every grave bearing his name belonged to another cycle. But there was one memory the gods had never managed to erase completely. It was hidden inside the deepest part of Caleb's mind. A memory of the day he decided to fight back. Caleb had gathered the villagers and told them the truth. He told them the gods were using them. He told them the creature beneath the mountain was not their enemy. He told them the sacrifices had never protected Blackthorn. They had only maintained the gods' power. The villagers believed him at first. Then Malachar appeared. He spoke a single command, and every villager forgot Caleb's words. Everyone except Caleb. That was when the gods realized they could no longer control him. They attacked him. Caleb fought back. The battle destroyed the original temple. Mountains shook. The river changed course. Thousands of people died. And when it was over, Caleb stood over the three fallen gods. He had killed them. But the gods had prepared for that possibility. Before their deaths, they divided their souls and hid fragments of themselves inside the village. They created a cycle that would continue even after their bodies were destroyed. Every 12 years, their influence would return. Every time Caleb was reborn, the villagers would be manipulated into killing him before he could remember. And every time he died, the gods' fragments grew stronger. Caleb had not been trapped in Blackthorn by chains. He had been trapped by a story that repeated itself. Now that story was finally breaking. Caleb opened his eyes inside the underground chamber. Daniel Reeves was still beside him, trembling. The villagers were scattered across the floor. Samuel Crow was staring at Caleb as though he were looking at a ghost. "You remember," Samuel whispered. Caleb slowly stood. "Everything." Samuel's face became pale. "Then you know what happens next." Caleb looked at him. "Yes." Samuel stepped backward. "You know what you did." Caleb nodded. "I know what I did." Samuel's voice cracked. "You destroyed the first village." Caleb looked toward the stone floor. "Because the village was already being destroyed from within." Samuel shook his head. "You killed innocent people." Caleb's expression hardened. "And you killed innocent people for generations." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "We had no choice." Caleb walked closer. "You always had a choice." Then the chamber shook again. The enormous black hand beneath the floor disappeared. The cracks closed. The strange heartbeat stopped. For several seconds, nobody moved. Caleb expected the creature to rise. Instead, a voice spoke through the stone. It was calm, almost gentle. "Caleb." Daniel looked around. "Where is that voice coming from?" Caleb answered quietly. "Everywhere." The voice continued. "You have remembered enough." Caleb stared at the ground. "Who are you?" The answer came immediately. "The one you were ordered to destroy." Caleb closed his eyes. He had heard that voice many times in his previous lives. It was the voice that had whispered to him in dreams. The voice that had warned him not to trust the gods. The voice that had called him creator. "Are you the creature beneath the mountain?" Caleb asked. "No," a pause. "I am what remains of the world before the gods." The chamber became silent. Daniel looked confused. Caleb understood immediately. The being beneath Blackthorn was not a monster in the traditional sense. It was an ancient force, something that existed before Malachar, Vera, and Orden. The gods had not created it. They had discovered it. They had feared it. And instead of destroying it, they had used it. They had taken pieces of its power and used those pieces to create immortal beings. Caleb was one of them. The gods had made him from the same ancient force they were trying to imprison. That was why Caleb could not truly die. His body belonged partly to the world beneath the mountain. His immortality was not a blessing from the gods. It was the reason they could never completely control him. Caleb suddenly understood why the villagers had always been afraid of him. They had been taught that he was the guardian of the village. But the truth was more complicated. Caleb was the guardian of the thing beneath it. And if he died, the prison would weaken. That was why the village had to keep him alive. But if Caleb remembered his true identity, the gods would lose control of him. So they had created the cycle. Kill him. Erase him. Rebirth. Repeat. It had worked for centuries. Until now. Caleb turned toward Daniel. "We need to leave." Daniel looked at the sealed doorway. "How?" Caleb looked at Samuel. "He knows the way." Samuel said nothing. Caleb stepped closer. Open the door. Samuel shook his head. If I do, they will come. Caleb frowned. Who? Samuel looked upward. The ones who have been waiting for you. Suddenly, every candle in the chamber lit at once. The villagers gasped. A cold wind moved through the room. The stone walls began to glow. 3 enormous symbols appeared above the altar. Caleb recognized them immediately. Malachar, Vera, Orden. The gods were returning, not in physical bodies, in memories. Every person in the chamber began screaming. Their faces changed as memories from previous lives flooded into their minds. Some villagers fell to the ground. Others began begging for forgiveness. An elderly man suddenly looked at Caleb and cried, I remember killing you. A woman beside him screamed, I remember burning your house. Another man whispered, I remember watching them erase your mother. Caleb stood completely still. For centuries, he had believed his mother was a dream. Now he remembered her face, her voice, her hands. He remembered her teaching him how to read. He remembered the day she disappeared. He remembered the villagers telling him she had died. But she had not died. She had been taken beneath the temple because she had discovered the same secret. Caleb began crying, not from fear, from grief. He had lived for more than 200 years believing he had no family. Now he understood that someone had deliberately taken his memories from him. He had spent centuries searching for answers that had been hidden inside his own mind. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Caleb wiped his face. I spent so long thinking immortality was the worst thing that ever happened to me. He looked toward the symbols above the altar. It wasn't. Daniel asked, then what was? Caleb answered, forgetting. The symbols suddenly disappeared. Then Samuel collapsed. Caleb rushed toward him. The old man's body was shaking. Samuel. The elder looked up. His eyes were no longer human. A black mark had appeared across his forehead. Caleb stepped backward. You're one of them. Samuel's voice changed. 3 voices spoke through him at once. Not one. All. 3. Caleb raised his hand. Samuel's body lifted from the floor. The 3 gods were using him as a vessel. Malachar spoke first. You have caused enough suffering. Caleb stared at him. You've been killing me for centuries. Vera answered. You were given a purpose. Caleb laughed bitterly. A purpose you created. Orden spoke. We created you. Caleb's eyes hardened. And that was your mistake. Samuel's body began transforming. Black cracks spread across his skin. His eyes became completely white. The ground beneath him shattered. The villagers fled. Daniel grabbed Caleb's arm. We have to go. Caleb shook his head. No, Daniel stared at him. Why? Caleb looked at Samuel. Because this ends tonight. Samuel attacked. The force of the impact sent Caleb across the chamber. He crashed into the stone wall. Daniel screamed his name. Caleb stood again. His body was already healing. Samuel charged once more. Caleb blocked the attack with his arm. The stone floor beneath his feet cracked. Samuel was stronger than any human could be. But Caleb had fought him before. Not once. Hundreds of times. And this time, Caleb remembered every move. Samuel swung. Caleb stepped aside. Samuel attacked again. Caleb ducked. A third strike came. Caleb caught his wrist. You always do that. Samuel froze. Caleb twisted his arm. You always attack from the left after the second strike. Samuel's eyes widened. Caleb struck him across the chest. The vessel crashed into the altar. The symbols above it shattered. For the first time, the gods screamed. Caleb looked at the broken symbols. You're losing your connection. Vera's voice echoed through Samuel. You cannot destroy us. Caleb walked toward him. I don't need to. He placed his hand against Samuel's chest. I only need to make everyone remember. A pulse of white light exploded through the chamber. Every memory hidden by the gods returned. The villagers saw everything. They saw the sacrifices. They saw the erased children. They saw the manipulated families. They saw every life Caleb had lived. They saw every time they had killed him. And they finally understood. They had not been protecting Blackthorn. They had been protecting the lie that controlled them. Samuel screamed as the 3 gods were forced out of his body. 3 enormous shadows rose above the altar. Malachar, Vera, Orden. They were weakened, but not defeated. Malachar looked at Caleb. You think remembering will save you? Caleb said nothing. Vera smiled. You still haven't remembered the final truth. Caleb's expression changed. What final truth? Orden answered. You did not create the cycle. Caleb froze. We did. The gods disappeared. The chamber fell silent. Caleb looked toward the stone floor. The ancient voice returned. Caleb, he whispered, what did they mean? The voice answered, they lied about one more thing. Caleb waited. You were not created to guard me. Then why was I created? The voice became quieter. You were created to destroy me. Caleb's blood ran cold. The entire chamber shook. Daniel whispered, what does that mean? Caleb stared at the ground. The ancient voice continued. Before the gods became gods, there was a war. Between whom? Between me and you. Caleb stepped backward. You said I was your creator. I called you that because you created the body you now possess. Caleb couldn't speak. The voice continued. You were not my guardian. You were my enemy. Caleb suddenly saw another memory. A battlefield. Thousands of bodies. 3 gods watching from the mountains. And Caleb standing opposite the ancient being. He saw himself raising a sword. He heard himself say, I will end you. Then the memory changed. The ancient being defeated him. Instead of killing him, it offered him a choice. Forget, or remember forever. Caleb had chosen to forget. He had chosen to become human. But the gods had interfered. They turned his chosen forgetting into a prison. They created Blackthorn around him. They created the cycle. And they used his own immortality against him. Caleb dropped the sword. He finally understood why the voice beneath the earth had always sounded familiar. It wasn't an enemy. It was the person he had once loved. His first companion. The being he had fought. The being he had betrayed. And the reason the gods had been terrified of Caleb remembering. Because if Caleb remembered the entire truth, he might choose the ancient being over the gods. Caleb turned toward the chamber entrance. Samuel was still alive. Barely. Where is the exit? Caleb asked. Samuel pointed toward the wall. Behind the altar. Caleb moved the stone. A passage appeared. He looked back at the villagers. Leave. Nobody moved. Caleb repeated himself. Leave Blackthorn. A woman asked, where will we go? Caleb looked toward the opening. Anywhere you want. But the village was never your home. One by one, they began walking away. Daniel remained. Caleb looked at him. You too. Daniel shook his head. I'm staying. You don't understand. I understand enough. Daniel looked at the destroyed temple. They lied to all of us. Caleb nodded. Yes. Daniel looked at him. Then don't face them alone. For the first time in centuries, Caleb smiled. All right. They left the underground chamber. By sunrise, Blackthorn was empty. Families traveled toward neighboring towns. Some walked toward the mountains. Others followed the river. Nobody knew what waited beyond the valley. But for the first time, they were free to discover it. Caleb and Daniel remained at the edge of the village. The church stood behind them. The mountains stood ahead. Caleb looked back one final time. Blackthorn had been his prison for centuries. But he didn't hate it. He hated the lie. And he knew the gods were still alive. 3 days later, Caleb and Daniel reached the eastern mountain pass. For the first time in his life, Caleb walked beyond the boundary. Nothing happened. No sickness. No dizziness. No invisible force pulling him back. He stopped. Daniel looked at him. What? Caleb smiled. I've never been this far. Daniel laughed. You're more than 200 years old. I know. And this is your first time leaving? Caleb looked toward the distant horizon. Apparently, they continued walking. But neither of them noticed the figure standing on the mountain behind them. A woman. Young. Wearing a silver necklace. Caleb stopped. He turned around. The woman was gone. Daniel asked, what is it? Caleb stared at the mountain. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. He recognized that necklace. It belonged to Clara Whitmore. And Clara was supposed to be dead. That night, Caleb dreamed. He stood inside the ancient chamber again. But this time, the 3 gods were gone. Only the 4th throne remained. Caleb approached it. A voice whispered, sit. He refused. The voice came again. Sit, Caleb. He looked behind the throne. There was a door. He opened it. Beyond the door was a vast white landscape. Thousands of people stood there. Men, women, children, all carrying the same scar beneath their left eyes. All looking exactly like him. Caleb stepped backward. One of them approached. An older version of himself. The man smiled. You finally made it. Caleb asked, who are you? The man answered, I am the first Caleb. Caleb stared at him. What does that mean? The man looked toward the horizon. The one who came before the gods. Caleb felt a chill. Why are you here? The first Caleb looked at him. Because you are approaching the end of the cycle. Caleb asked, how do I end it? The first Caleb smiled sadly. You don't. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Then who does? The man pointed behind him. Caleb turned. 3 shadows stood in the distance. Malakar, Vera, Orden. But they were not alone. Behind them stood something much larger. Something that made even the gods look small. The first Caleb whispered. That is what the gods were afraid you would remember. Caleb woke suddenly. The sun had not risen. Daniel was sleeping nearby. Caleb looked down at his hands. The black mark from the temple had spread farther. His eyes began glowing. Then someone knocked on the cabin door. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Caleb froze. Nobody knew where they were. He slowly opened the door. Clara Whitmore stood outside. Her silver necklace hung around her neck. Her eyes were filled with tears. Caleb couldn't speak. Clara looked at him. You shouldn't have left Blackthorn. Caleb whispered. You're alive. She shook her head. No. She stepped closer. I've been dead for 300 years. Caleb's face went pale. Clara touched his chest. The gods have been using me to watch you. Caleb looked at her. Why come now? Clara looked toward the dark forest. Because they're coming. Who? She answered with a trembling voice. Everyone you've ever killed. Caleb stood completely still. Behind Clara, hundreds of figures appeared between the trees. All of them carried the same scar. All of them looked like people Caleb remembered. People from his past lives. People he had forgotten. People who had died because of him. Daniel woke behind him. What is happening? Caleb stared into the darkness. For centuries, he had believed the village was his greatest enemy. He had believed the gods were the ones controlling his fate. He had believed his second chance existed so he could expose the truth. But now he understood. The village was only the beginning. The gods were only one part of the story. And the creature beneath Blackthorn had never been the final threat. The real secret was Caleb himself. Every life he had lived had been part of a war. Every death had been a reset. Every memory had been a weapon. And now, for the first time, he remembered enough to understand why the gods had been willing to destroy an entire village just to keep him silent. Caleb looked at Daniel. Stay behind me. Daniel stepped forward. No. Caleb looked at him. Daniel tightened his grip on the sword Caleb had given him. We started this together. Caleb smiled. Then let's finish it together. The figures in the forest began moving. One step, then another. Caleb raised his sword. But before the first figure reached them, the entire sky turned black. A voice thundered across the mountains. Caleb Mercer. The ground shook. The forest went silent. Every figure stopped. Clara looked upward. Daniel whispered, What is that? Caleb already knew. The voice belonged to the first god, Malakar. But this time, he wasn't speaking from Samuel's body. He was speaking from the heavens. You wanted the truth. Caleb looked up. Then hear it. 3 enormous faces appeared among the clouds. Malakar, Vera, Orden, and behind them, a 4th face. One Caleb had never seen before. The face of himself, but older, colder, and wearing a crown. Caleb's sword fell from his hand. The 4th figure smiled. I told you. Caleb stared upward. The figure continued. You were never the victim. The sky cracked. You were the beginning. The earth beneath Caleb opened. The black mark on his chest burned. His memories surged one final time. And then he understood the truth. The gods had not resurrected him to give him a second chance. They had resurrected him because they needed him. They needed the one person powerful enough to open the ancient prison. They needed Caleb to remember. They needed Caleb to return to the place where everything began. Because the creature beneath Blackthorn was not waiting to escape. It was waiting for Caleb. And now Caleb finally remembered the promise he had made thousands of years ago. He had promised that if the gods ever returned, he would end their reign. Caleb picked up his sword. He looked toward the dark sky. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what he remembered. He was afraid of what he was about to become. The figures disappeared. The clouds cleared. The sun began rising over the mountains. Caleb turned toward Daniel and Clara. We're going back. Daniel asked. Back to Blackthorn? Caleb shook his head. Not Blackthorn. Then where? Caleb looked beyond the mountains. To the place where I was born. They began walking. Behind them, the village remained silent. Ahead of them waited a world Caleb had never seen. And somewhere beneath that world, the ancient enemy was waiting. But Caleb was no longer running from his past. He was walking directly toward it. Years later, people would tell stories about the man who returned from the dead. Some would call him a monster. Some would call him a god. Some would say he destroyed the old gods and saved humanity. Others would say he became something worse than the gods themselves. But the truth was simpler. Caleb Mercer was a man who had been denied his memories for centuries. He was a man who had been murdered for discovering the truth. He was a man who had been reborn with one final chance. And when that chance came, he chose not revenge. He chose freedom. The village that had imprisoned him was gone. The gods that had manipulated him were broken. The cycle that had trapped him for centuries had ended. And for the first time, Caleb was truly free. But freedom came with a price. Because the ancient voice beneath the world had warned him that remembering everything would change him. And it had. Caleb had begun his journey as an immortal young man searching for the reason he could never die. He ended it understanding that death had never been his curse. Forgetting had been. And when he finally remembered who he was, the gods were the ones who became afraid. So if there is one lesson hidden inside Caleb's story, it is this. Sometimes the greatest prison isn't made of stone. Sometimes it is made of lies. Sometimes the people telling you they are protecting you are the very people keeping you trapped. And sometimes the truth is so powerful that an entire world can be built around hiding it. Caleb's story began inside a grave. It ended with him walking freely into a world that had been hidden from him for centuries. But the final question remains. If you had been Caleb, if you discovered that everyone you trusted had lied to you, if you discovered that your memories had been stolen, if you discovered that your death had happened hundreds of times, would you forgive the people who betrayed you? Or would you make them pay? Because Caleb chose forgiveness. And that choice may have saved the world. Or it may have given the ancient darkness exactly what it wanted. The last thing Caleb heard before leaving the mountains was the same voice that had awakened him inside his grave. Only this time, it did not sound threatening. It sounded almost grateful. Welcome home. Caleb stopped. He turned toward the mountains one final time. Then he smiled, because somewhere inside him, he knew the truth. This time, he wasn't returning as a prisoner. He was returning as the man who had finally remembered everything. And no god, no village, no ancient creature could ever erase him again.